The sulfur stench hit them first, thick, acrid, and alien. As the landing craft approached the volcanic shores of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, Marine Private First Class Tony Stein gripped his modified Browning machine gun tighter. The 8-square-mile island loomed before them like a fortress carved from hell itself, its black sand beaches eerily quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. "Something's not right," muttered Corporal James Bradley, adjusting his medical kit. The silence was deafening. Where were the defenders? Where was the artillery fire that had greeted them at every other Pacific landing? The first wave of Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beach at 900 hours. Their boots sank deep into the volcanic ash, making each step a struggle. The fine black sand clung to everything: weapons, uniforms, skin. It was like walking through ground glass mixed with charcoal. For 15 precious minutes, the Marines advanced inland unopened. They moved cautiously across the terraced landscape, past strange rock formations and sulfur vents that hissed like serpents. Some men even began to hope that perhaps the weeks of bombing had done their work too well. Then the earth exploded around them. From hidden positions carved deep into the volcanic rock, Japanese guns opened fire with devastating precision. Artillery shells and mortar rounds rained down from Mount Suribachi, the 546-foot extinct volcano that dominated the southern tip of the island. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed pillboxes, cross-hatching the beach with deadly accuracy. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's defensive strategy was now horrifyingly clear. The Japanese commander had learned from previous island defeats. Rather than contest the beaches directly, he had honeycombed Iwo Jima with an elaborate network of bunkers, tunnels, and fighting positions. 22,000 defenders waited in this underground fortress, ready to sell their lives as dearly as possible. "Get off the beach! Move inland!" screamed company commanders. But the black sand made rapid movement impossible. Men fell by the dozens as Japanese mortars found their range. The volcanic ash that cushioned their landing now became a trap, sucking at their boots and making them easy targets. Private First Class Stein, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, moved forward with his improvised weapon, a stripped-down aircraft machine gun he had nicknamed Stinger. He had modified the .30 caliber Browning himself, removing the barrel shroud and bipod to make it lighter. Now he used it to devastating effect, clearing Japanese positions with methodical precision. By nightfall, 30,000 Marines had come ashore, but at a terrible cost. The beaches were littered with the dead and wounded, their blood mixing with the black volcanic sand to create a grotesque crimson-tinged landscape. Medical corpsmen like Bradley worked frantically to evacuate the wounded back to the ships offshore. But the constant artillery fire made their work nearly impossible. As darkness fell over Iwo Jima, the Marines dug foxholes in the volcanic ash and prepared for what they knew would be a long, brutal campaign. Above them, Mount Suribachi loomed like a malevolent giant, its slopes bristling with enemy guns. None of them could have imagined that in just 4 days, that same mountain would become the site of the most famous photograph in military history. The battle for Iwo Jima had begun, and it would test the limits of human courage and endurance. Dawn brought no relief to the Marines trapped on the blood-soaked beaches. As the sun rose over Iwo Jima on February 20th, the true nightmare of Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece became apparent. The Japanese had transformed the island into a 3-dimensional killing field, with over 11 miles of interconnected tunnels carved deep into the volcanic rock. Sergeant John Basilone, a Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal leading a machine gun section, quickly realized this would be unlike any battle they had previously fought. "They're not coming at us in banzai charges," he told his men as they advanced inland. "They're going to make us dig them out, one hole at a time." The Marines soon discovered that traditional tactics were useless against Kuribayashi's fortress island. Artillery bombardments that would have devastated conventional positions barely scratched the Japanese defenders hidden in their underground warrens. Some bunkers had been carved 15 feet deep into solid rock, with multiple levels connected by a maze of passages. According to historical records from the U.S. Marine Corps archives, the Japanese defensive network included over 1,500 rooms and chambers, connected by 16 miles of tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen across the island. Every cave, every rocky outcropping, every innocent-looking pile of stones concealed death. Japanese soldiers would emerge from spider holes to fire a few shots, then vanish back underground before the Marines could respond. Snipers appeared from positions that had been cleared hours earlier. Artillery observers hidden in camouflaged positions called down precise fire on any Marine movement. The terrain itself seemed designed to aid the defenders. The volcanic ash muffled footsteps and absorbed the impact of explosions. Strange rock formations provided natural camouflage for defensive positions. Sulfur vents created visual distortions that made accurate shooting nearly impossible at longer ranges. Staff Sergeant Tony Stein distinguished himself during these early days of fighting, using his modified machine gun to suppress Japanese positions, while his squad advanced. On February 20th alone, he made 8 separate trips across open ground under heavy fire to resupply his weapon and evacuate wounded Marines. His improvised Stinger gun proved devastatingly effective against the Japanese bunkers. The Marines adapted with characteristic ingenuity. Flamethrower teams became the weapon of choice for clearing bunkers and caves. Combat engineers used explosive charges to seal tunnel entrances after clearing them, only to watch in frustration as Japanese soldiers emerged from previously unknown passages. Hours later, Corpsman Bradley found himself treating wounds unlike any he had seen in previous campaigns. The volcanic glass in the black sand caused infected lacerations that were difficult to heal. The sulfur in the air aggravated respiratory problems, and the constant stress of fighting an enemy who could appear anywhere at any time wore heavily on the men's nerves. By the end of the second day, Marine casualties had exceeded 5,000, men killed and wounded. The advance inland had gained barely a few hundred yards at some points. Mount Suribachi still dominated the southern end of the island, its slopes concealing hundreds of defensive positions. But the Marines pressed on, with grim determination. They had learned to respect their enemy's tactical skill while maintaining their own fighting spirit. Each bunker cleared, each tunnel sealed, each defensive position reduced, brought them one step closer to their objective. As night fell on February 20th, the Marines consolidated their positions and prepared for another day of brutal fighting. They had penetrated Kuribayashi's outer defensive ring, but the most heavily fortified positions still lay ahead. The real test of their courage and endurance was yet to come. The third day dawned with a blood-red sunrise that seemed to mirror the carnage below. February 21st brought intensified fighting as the 28th Marines, commanded by Colonel Harry Liversedge, began their assault on the most formidable objective on Iwo Jima, Mount Suribachi. The extinct volcano loomed 546 feet above the southern beaches, its slopes honeycomb with defensive positions that had been years in the making. From its summit, Japanese observers could direct artillery fire across the entire landing zone. Until Suribachi fell, no Marine on the island would be safe from its overlooking menace. Private First Class Stein's company was among those tasked with the mountain assault. As they approached the base of Suribachi, the Marines encountered a defensive network that defied imagination. Every natural cave had been expanded and reinforced. Artificial tunnels connected positions across the mountain's face. Gun emplacements had been carved directly into the volcanic rock, their barrels barely visible until they opened fire. "It's like fighting a mountain that shoots back," observed Lieutenant Harold Schreier as his platoon took cover behind a rocky outcropping. Japanese defenders had spent months preparing their positions, using mining equipment to carve elaborate defensive works deep into Suribachi's volcanic slopes. The Marines attacked with methodical precision, using tactics developed through bitter experience in previous Pacific campaigns. Flamethrower teams led the assault, their weapons proving uniquely effective against the cave-dwelling defenders. Combat engineers followed closely, sealing cleared positions with explosive charges to prevent reoccupation. Sergeant Michael Strank, a veteran Marine from Pennsylvania, led his squad in a devastating attack against a cluster of Japanese bunkers on the mountain's eastern slope. His precise use of demolition charges and coordinated fire from his men's rifles systematically reduced one defensive position after another. The fighting was intimate and brutal. Marines found themselves crawling through narrow tunnels, never knowing what waited around the next turn. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination, often choosing death rather than surrender. Smoke from explosions and sulfur from natural vents created a choking fog that limited visibility to a few yards. Corpsman Bradley worked tirelessly to evacuate wounded Marines from the mountain slopes, often exposing himself to enemy fire to reach fallen men. The steep terrain made stretcher evacuation nearly impossible, forcing corpsmen to carry wounded Marines on their backs down the treacherous volcanic slopes. By late afternoon on February 21st, the Marines had carved out several footholds on Suribachi's lower slopes, but the summit remained firmly in Japanese hands. Each gained yard had cost blood, and the mountain still bristled with defensive positions. As darkness approached, Colonel Liversedge made the difficult decision to suspend the assault until dawn. His Marines had fought with incredible courage, but Suribachi would require at least another full day of concentrated effort. The mountain's defenders had proven as formidable as their reputation suggested. That night, as Marines consolidated their positions around Suribachi's base, they could hear the sounds of their enemies above them, scraping, digging, preparing new defensive positions. The Japanese were using the darkness to reorganize their defenses and evacuate their wounded through the tunnel network that connected the mountain to the rest of the island. Private First Class Stein cleaned his modified machine gun by moonlight, preparing for another day of close-quarters combat. Around him, his fellow Marines checked weapons, wrote letters home, and tried to grab whatever sleep they could manage. Tomorrow would bring renewed assault on the fortress mountain, and they all knew that Suribachi's capture would be essential for the success of the entire Iwo Jima operation. The most famous photograph in military history was now less than 48 hours away. February 23, 1945, dawned clear and cold over Iwo Jima. After 3 days of brutal fighting, the 28th Marines prepared for what they hoped would be the final assault on Mount Suribachi. The volcanic peak had become a symbol of Japanese resistance, and its capture would provide both strategic advantage and psychological victory for the American forces. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, selected a 40-man patrol to probe Suribachi's summit. Led by Lieutenant Harold Schreer, the patrol included Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Ira Hayes, among others. Each man carried extra ammunition and grenades, expecting fierce resistance at the mountain's crown. The patrol began their climb at 800 hours, moving cautiously up the steep volcanic slopes. They encountered scattered resistance, a sniper here, a concealed machine gun position there, but nothing like the concentrated firepower they had expected. Many of the Japanese defenders had withdrawn during the night, falling back to secondary defensive positions deeper in the island's interior. As they climbed higher, the Marines could see the entire battle spread out below them. To the north, the main body of Marine forces was still locked in fierce combat with Kuribayashi's primary defensive lines. The black beaches were covered with landing craft, supplies, and the ongoing flow of reinforcements. Smoke from burning vehicles and exploding ammunition created a hellish panorama. At 10:20 hours, Schreer's patrol reached Suribachi's summit. After a brief firefight that eliminated the last pockets of resistance, they found themselves in control of the mountain that had dominated Iwo Jima's southern approaches. The view from the top was both magnificent and sobering. They could see the entire island laid out before them, and the enormity of the task still ahead became clear. Lieutenant Schreier had carried a small American flag with him, measuring 54 by 28 inches. At approximately 10:30 hours, he and 5 other Marines raised this flag on a length of Japanese pipe they had found among the debris on the summit. The first flag raising was witnessed by Marines fighting below, who cheered and pointed, as the stars and stripes appeared against the sky. Word of Suribachi's capture spread quickly through the Marine units below. For men who had spent 4 days under constant observation and artillery fire from the mountain, seeing the American flag flying from its summit provided an enormous morale boost. However, the fighting was far from over. The capture of Suribachi represented only the first phase of the Iwo Jima campaign. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson decided that the original flag was too small to be seen clearly from the beaches below. He ordered his adjutant to find a larger flag and have it raised in place of the first one. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had missed the first flag raising, positioned himself to capture the second ceremony. At approximately 1500 hours, 6 Marines gathered around a longer piece of pipe with a larger flag attached. Sergeant Strank, Corporal Block, Private First Class Hayes, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class René Gagnon, and Navy Hospital Corpsman, Second Class John Bradley, prepared to raise the replacement flag. As they lifted the heavy pipe with its attached banner, Rosenthal clicked his camera shutter at precisely the right moment. The photograph would capture not just 6 men raising a flag, but the spirit of American determination and sacrifice in World War II. The image would become instantly iconic, symbolizing victory over overwhelming odds and the price of freedom. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi marked a crucial turning point in the battle for Iwo Jima, but it was far from the end of the fighting. The most heavily fortified Japanese positions still lay ahead, and the bloodiest days of the campaign were yet to come. The euphoria following Suribachi's capture proved tragically short-lived. As the Marines turned their attention northward toward the main Japanese defensive lines, they encountered Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's most formidable fortifications. The northern 2/3 of Iwo Jima had been transformed into a fortress that would test every lesson learned in 3 years of Pacific warfare. The terrain itself seemed designed to favor the defenders. Rocky ridges, deep ravines, and natural caves provided perfect concealment for Japanese positions. The volcanic soil made digging nearly impossible, forcing Marines to attack across open ground while their enemies remained hidden in reinforced bunkers carved into solid rock. Corporal James Bradley, one of the flag raisers who had quickly returned to his duties as a Navy corpsman, found himself treating casualties at an unprecedented rate. The Japanese defensive strategy had evolved beyond anything the Marines had previously encountered. Instead of the traditional banzai charges that had marked earlier Pacific battles, Kuribayashi's forces fought from carefully prepared positions, inflicting maximum casualties while conserving their own strength. The main Japanese defensive line centered on a series of ridges that the Marines would later name for their bloody cost: Hill 257, Hill 382, and the Meat Grinder. Each position had been prepared with meticulous care, featuring interlocking fields of fire, multiple defensive levels, and extensive tunnel systems that allowed defenders to move between positions undetected. Private First Class Tony Stein continued to distinguish himself with his modified machine gun, but even his devastating firepower seemed inadequate against the Japanese fortifications. Concrete bunkers absorbed direct hits from artillery and naval gunfire. Cave positions carved deep into volcanic rock remained operational even after repeated bombardments. The Marines adapted their tactics with characteristic flexibility. Flamethrower teams became the primary assault weapon, their fuel capable of penetrating the deepest bunkers. Combat engineers perfected the technique of corkscrew and blow, drilling into bunker walls and inserting explosive charges directly into enemy positions. According to battlefield reports archived in the Marine Corps Historical Division, the average daily casualty rate during this phase of the battle exceeded 1,000 men per day, a staggering number that reflected the intensity of the fighting and the strength of Japanese defenses. Weather became an additional enemy. Cold. Rain turned the volcanic ash into a muddy paste that clung to everything. The sulfur content in the soil caused equipment to corrode rapidly and created respiratory problems for Marines already exhausted by combat. Supply lines struggled to keep pace with the enormous consumption of ammunition and medical supplies. The psychological toll was equally severe. Marines who had survived multiple Pacific campaigns found themselves tested beyond their previous limits. The constant threat of sniper fire, the sudden appearance of Japanese soldiers from previously cleared areas, and the grinding nature of the cave-by-cave fighting wore heavily on men's nerves. Staff Sergeant John Basilone, the Medal of Honor recipient who had volunteered to return to combat duty, was killed during the assault on the main defensive lines. His death symbolized the price being paid for each yard of volcanic soil gained. Even the most experienced Marines were falling to the deadly efficiency of Kuribayashi's defensive network. Yet the Marines pressed forward with grim determination. Each bunker cleared, each ridge captured, each defensive line breached, brought them closer to victory. They had learned to respect their enemy's tactical skill while maintaining confidence in their own superior training and equipment. By the end of February, Marine casualties had exceeded 15,000 men, more than half the original landing force. But Japanese resistance was beginning to show signs of strain. Communication between defensive positions had been disrupted, and the tunnel network that had been so effective was gradually being sealed by systematic Marine demolition efforts. The battle for Iwo Jima was entering its final phase, but the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. March arrived on Iwo Jima with no reduction in the intensity of combat. The Marines had gained barely half the island after 2 weeks of brutal fighting, and Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's remaining defenders had concentrated in the most heavily fortified positions in the northern sector. The final assault would test the limits of Marine endurance and courage. The Japanese commander had prepared his ultimate defensive line along a series of rocky ridges and deep ravines that offered perfect concealment and interlocking fields of fire. Every cave had been expanded into a miniature fortress. Every ravine had been turned into a killing ground. The defenders knew this would be their final stand, and they prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Major General Graves Erskine's 3rd Marine Division joined the assault, bringing fresh troops to replace the decimated units that had carried the fight since the landing. But even these reinforcements found themselves immediately caught up in the grinding, cave-by-cave fighting that had characterized the Iwo Jima campaign. The Marines had perfected their tactics through bitter experience. Tank infantry teams worked in close coordination with Sherman tanks providing direct fire support, while Marines cleared the inevitable infantry positions that tanks could not reach. Flamethrower operators had become the elite of the assault teams, their weapons capable of reaching into the deepest bunkers and caves. Navy Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class John Bradley, who had become famous as one of the flag raisers on Mount Suribachi, continued his duties treating wounded Marines under increasingly dangerous conditions. The confined nature of the fighting meant that corpsmen often had to crawl into caves and tunnels to reach wounded men, exposing themselves to the same dangers faced by the assault troops. The Japanese defenders fought with a desperation born of certain defeat. Cut off from resupply and reinforcement, they nevertheless continued to inflict heavy casualties on their attackers. Their defensive positions had been prepared over months of careful work, and each position required individual attention from Marine assault teams. Private Franklin Sousley, another of the Suribachi flag raisers, was killed during the final assault. On March 21st, His death underscored the continuing cost of victory, even as Japanese resistance began to weaken under the relentless Marine pressure. The iconic photograph that had made him famous meant nothing in the face of Japanese bullets and grenades. Combat engineers played an increasingly important role as the campaign entered its final phase. Their expertise in demolitions and tunnel warfare proved essential for reducing the most stubborn Japanese positions. Teams of engineers would crawl through captured tunnel systems, mapping their extent and placing explosive charges to seal them permanently. The psychological strain on both sides had reached extreme levels. Marines who had survived the entire campaign showed signs of combat fatigue that had accumulated over weeks of continuous fighting. Japanese defenders, cut off from communication with higher headquarters and facing inevitable defeat, fought with the fanaticism of men who had nothing left to lose. Artillery support became more difficult as the battle lines compressed, and Marines fought in close proximity to remaining Japanese positions. Naval gunfire, which had been crucial during the early stages of the campaign, was largely ineffective against the deep cave positions that characterized the final defensive line. By mid-March, Marine casualties had exceeded 20,000 men, AE, number that represented more than 70% of the original landing force. But Japanese resistance was finally beginning to collapse under the sustained pressure. Communication between defensive positions had been almost entirely severed, and ammunition supplies were running critically low. The end was approaching, but it would come only after the most desperate fighting of the entire campaign. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's final gamble would test Marine courage one last time before victory could be declared on the Sulphur Island. The end came not with dramatic charges or spectacular explosions, but with the methodical reduction of the last Japanese strongholds scattered across northern Iwo Jima. By March 20, 1945, Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's defense had been compressed into a series of isolated pockets, each fighting independently as the elaborate tunnel network that had connected them was systematically destroyed. The final week of fighting was perhaps the most brutal of the entire campaign. Japanese defenders, knowing that death was certain, regardless of surrender, fought with desperate ferocity in their remaining cave positions. Marines, exhausted after a month of continuous combat, pressed forward with grim determination to finish what they had started on the black beaches of February 19th. Corpsman John Bradley, despite his fame as one of the flag raisers, continued, treating wounded Marines until he was himself wounded by shrapnel on March 12th. His evacuation symbolized the toll that 36 days of fighting had taken on even the most iconic figures of the campaign. The photograph that had made him famous seemed to belong to another era, though barely 3 weeks had passed. The Marines employed every weapon and tactic developed during 3 years of Pacific warfare. Napalm dropped by carrier aircraft burned out cave positions that conventional weapons could not reach. Combat engineers used explosive charges placed by hand to collapse tunnel systems. Flamethrower teams worked with methodical precision to clear the deepest bunkers. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi himself remained defiant to the end. Cut off from communication with Tokyo and facing certain defeat, he prepared for a final gesture that would honor the samurai tradition he embodied. On March 26th, he led approximately 300 surviving Japanese soldiers in a pre-dawn attack against Marine positions near the northwestern coast. The final banzai charge was unlike the massive human wave attacks that had characterized earlier Pacific battles. Kuribayashi's men moved with tactical precision, using the darkness and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to inflict maximum casualties before being annihilated. The Japanese general himself was killed during the attack, his body never definitively identified among the dead. At 1800 hours on March 26, 1945, Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, declared Iwo Jima officially secure. The announcement marked the end of 36 days of fighting that had cost the lives of nearly 7,000 Americans and more than 18,000 Japanese defenders. The statistics were staggering. American casualties totaled 28, 1,686 men, including 6,821 killed in action. These numbers represented more than 30% of the total American force committed to the operation. Japanese casualties were even more severe. Of the original 22,000 defenders, fewer than 200 survived to be taken prisoner. The strategic value of Iwo Jima would prove significant in the final months of World War II. The island's airfields provided emergency landing sites for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan. More than 2,400 American airmen would eventually owe their lives to these facilities. But perhaps more importantly, the Battle of Iwo Jima had produced the most famous photograph in military history. Joe Rosenthal's image of 6 Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became an enduring symbol of American determination and sacrifice. The photograph would inspire war bond drives, memorial sculptures, and generations of Americans who saw in it the embodiment of their nation's fighting spirit. 3. Of the flag raisers, Corporal Harlan Block, Private Franklin Sousley, and Sergeant Michael Strank died in the fighting that followed their moment of fame. Their sacrifice, along with that of thousands of other Marines who fought and died on the Sulphur Island, ensured that Iwo Jima would be remembered not just for a photograph, but for the courage and determination it represented. The Black Sands of Iwo Jima had been purchased with American blood, but they would serve as stepping stones toward final victory in the Pacific War.